So I'm going to present around actually how I've been doing some work in terms of combining, I guess, some of the bits you can do within Storybook and also some of the stuff you can do within the app framework within Contentful and kind of bashing it together to hopefully build something which is useful for everybody in terms of your kind of team who's using Contentful. So kind of my background, I'm a techie, worked in various kind of roles, worked in agencies, and now working for a startup. And I will quickly kind of show you what I'm working on first, because I will show you some bits of this when we go through demos later on. So I'm working for a company called Planet Super League. We're a small startup. And the idea is actually what we're trying to do is infuse people about doing things to the environment by having them actually get points for their football club. So we're actually working with some community trusts associated with some teams in England. So we're working with community trusts associated with Aston Villa, Leicester, West Bromwich Albion, Wolves, and also some kind of other teams as well, up and down the football pyramid. And at the moment, Leicester are absolutely killing it. They're doing fantastically well in this challenge. And we're using Contentful for all of our content, kind of, obviously, so it's such a fantastic platform. And the two kind of main bits we're actually using Contentful for in terms of setup, because it's not the most complicated at the moment. We're creating component-driven pages. So this one on the left here is component-driven page, where you can just kind of drag and drop the different components and, you know, change the orders and what have you. And that works very well. And then secondly, we've got all these activities that you get these points for in order to get your team up the leaderboard. And we've also got all of those stored within Contentful as well. And then as users go through, they can actually see their impact in terms of what they're achieving for their club, and also actually what they're achieving for the environment as well, in terms of all of the fantastic actions they're actually doing. So that is Planet Super League. And so I've mentioned, obviously, I don't really have to introduce Contentful whatsoever. I'm assuming most people here have either heard, played around with, or just seen demos of Storybook. But I'll just touch first in terms of the absolute basics, in terms of how that works. It's kind of crucial in terms of where this talk will kind of develop. So Storybook, well, it's not hard, it's not rocket science, right? For those of you who've used it, I'm just going to jump out of my presentation here, and I will show you a demo Storybook that I've got nothing to do with, but I feel like it gives quite a good view of what you can actually achieve with Storybook. So for those of you who have seen it, this will look very familiar. So essentially what you're doing within Storybook is getting all of your front-end components, you're shoving it in here, and you're providing a way to actually have a nice visual way of looking over them. You can also validate your code is very much kind of self-encapsulated in terms of your components. They work very well. And from a QA point of view as well, you can just go in, you can play around with your components and just validate that the person who's coded it has actually done it in a, well, diligently, I guess, more than anything else. So we've got, for instance, a kind of card tab here, and on the Lonely Planet one, you can kind of see, well, actually how it behaves if it's a video, how does it behave if it's a book, well, actually, if you've got a price on it, how does the price come across? And we can do this for the various bits. So we've got things like carousels that they've got here as well that doesn't work particularly well on my screen, but it kind of gives you a bit of an idea. And what's really great with Storybook is some of the extensions. So I guess one of the kind of cool ones, and one of the things which I got my inspiration on for a lot of what I built here, is this one which is here is called Knobs. On the newer version of Storybook, it's actually called Controls, but it allows us to actually just play around with the content. So if I kind of just start typing in here, we can actually see that the text I'm writing under bullets is actually kind of appearing up here. And if I had an image path at the moment, I could actually swap out that image and we'd see a much more immediate change. So from a QA point of view, that's quite a useful tool to actually validate. And you can also get accessibility plugins and various bits to actually validate other stuff. And from a developer's point of view, if I'm coming onto a project, then I can actually see how stuff's been built in a very kind of isolated manner to be able to kind of take it and use it elsewhere. So absolutely fantastic tool, right? And jumping kind of back into here, and as most of you would have seen who have written the stories are just so simple to write. I mean, this is the example from actually creating a story in the first instance from the Storybook website. So you basically create a file which is called, in this case, button.stories.js. And as with many people, I generally do forget to put stories in the file name, and then I wonder why it doesn't actually show up any of my stories. You define actually what your template looks like. And then essentially each of your stories is just binding into that template and providing different arguments. So in this case, for the button, we've got a primary, a secondary, a large and a small button as they show up here. And actually, as you click through each of these different ones, you'll then just see a different state based on what args you're actually putting in. And that's basically the args. The args are basically your props going into the component you're using as your template. So that's, it's really cool. It's really useful. But if you look at actually the knobs or the controls, and in terms of your stories, in terms of actually validating what you're working on, you're kind of limited by what you're putting in the code in terms of your stories, and also what your team puts in. So say, for instance, your QA is kind of going into Storybook, and is just maybe they've got some test cases written up for this, and they're taking it from the test cases, writing it in. Or say, for instance, they're just doing some exploratory testing. Well, it can take a little bit of time, or it can be, if they're doing exploratory, how do you make sure that actually some of the things which may result in a problem, how do you make sure you catch that every time? How can we extend on this a bit? Well, actually, if you look at how the plugin system works within Storybook, it's actually incredibly straightforward. So again, this is just taken from the Storybook website, which is absolutely fantastic in terms of providing guidance around how to set any bits and pieces up. But this is the absolute most basic kind of add-on you can create in terms of just getting a panel in the bottom of your page. So you need to register an add-on. So in this case, they've just called it design add-on, and that's just a React component. And that's it. You can have whatever you want in that React component, and it's got various kind of bits and pieces you can actually hook into. And one of the key bits in terms of how knobs or controls work is actually one of the hooks which it utilizes. So there is a use args kind of hook, and within that you can actually pull out the args for a particular story. But key is obviously updating args here. And well, actually, I guess a kind of key story here is actually, rather than having our QA going in and manually editing, like, why don't we actually just load some real content? Why don't we actually create a block which can kind of sit in this bottom section here, and list it out? And this for me is where actually it kind of just makes sense to use Contentful. We can use the Contentful SDK to pull out the content we want, display it in a list, and then, click on it. Bob's your uncle, essentially. It just displays it for us. And it kind of is that straightforward, really. So if I kind of just go out and kind of just show you it in terms of how it sits, just give you a kind of quick reminder in terms of sites. It looks a little bit like this. We are actually kind of mobile only at the moment, so looks a little bit weird on desktop. So we've got all of these kind of lovely components here. And if we go into Storybook here, I've got it set up here. So we've got this dynamic pages kind of section, and essentially, which is where all of the bits from Contentful are going to be either dynamic component, generally going to be dynamic components. Then there's kind of activities as well, but most of the stuff's in here. And I guess to start with, I'll pick one of the simple ones. So if I just click on highlight stat here, which is very simple. So actually you can see straight away it's loaded on the Contentful kind of block here. We also do have controls here. So if I want to kind of go ahead and edit this, and I'm not going to write any sense here, I can see what happens if I change the text, right? Just as we saw kind of earlier, change the number here again, absolutely great. But actually the other thing I can do is I can just click on this, and actually it's loaded from Contentful this bit of content, and it just brings it straight into here. Where this starts, now in this case, we've actually got something that's very simple. We've just got some text fields, essentially nothing more than that. Where this starts getting a little bit, well, I'd say a lot more helpful, is we're actually looking at a more complex kind of layout. So I guess one of the limitations you get within Storybook is actually, if you look at the controls down here, well, actually, we've got a lot of sub-objects in here. And the way we represent this within Contentful is we've got a parent item, which is our kind of activity list. And then within that, we've just got allow child references, a list of child references. And actually, from a QA point of view, if you want to do some testing on that, it's obviously a little bit harder in terms of if you want to use Storybook for it. So actually, it's one of the ways where this is absolutely fantastic. So we've got a list here of the different columns we've got in place here, and actually I can just click on each of those. That one's a very short one, so we can kind of click through on that there, and we can just kind of click through and actually just see how it kind of all works. That's quite cool. And actually what's really useful with this as well is actually, probably not quite so much with this one, probably more on the last one, is actually as soon as I've adjusted the args, I can actually change them within here, within controls, as we got here, we're all kind of knobs in a previous version of Storybook as well. So I kind of go in here, I can just change it, and it kind of works in the same way. So it's kind of useful thing that we can kind of do here and kind of play around with. As you can see, there's a hell of a lot of content which is actually kind of utilized there, and click on those bits and pieces. And actually even up to kind of, as we got here, we've got basically a fairly empty one at the moment by default, but I can actually load it in as it displays in the page as well. to actually get a full kind of page view of what the user will actually see. So that's kind of interesting, right? But I guess the other thing is, if I kind of go back in here, is, well, kind of how does it work, and it's fairly straightforward. So we've got a Contentful SDK, and at the moment, I don't know if I should be kind of ashamed to say this or not, but we're actually using a RESTful SDK for this, and I can kind of go into the reasons why a little bit later in the talk. So we pull out all of the data from that. Depending on what type of content we want, we might actually need to pull for different depths in that. So say, for instance, when we looked at that one, which is just purely text, well, obviously we just need to pull that very top layer item. When it comes to the activity list, well, actually we need to go down a couple of items to make sure we pull all of the media. We obviously pull the kind of sub items, the activities as well. So we pull that stuff in, then on click, it's just updating the args. One thing to note here, if you are interested in exploring this further, I definitely recommend looking up the core events within Storybook, because I think there's about 20, 30 different core events you can actually hook into, which allows you kind of just to extend it a bit more. And actually the way this kind of works, it uses one of those hooks behind the scenes rather than actually using the use args as we just saw previously. And in terms of the plugin itself, well, we've got add-on panel exactly as we saw before. One thing to note here is actually this line here. So we're pulling out from a parameter of Contentful the content type, essentially the depth, and we define that at a template level, a stories kind of level, essentially. So within the stories, you set up your parameters. So it might be, for instance, on stories already, you're doing things like, for instance, setting the size of the window in case you want to show certain components on mobile, some on desktop. You can customize all of that stuff with parameters. Likewise with this, I've just set up parameters which exist via Contentful as a prefix, and then we can pull out a type and depth from that. That goes straight into Contentful item selected. API I've worded badly, but that is basically the Storybook API, and we make use of that in order to actually call the hooks in order to update the content fundamentally. And if we kind of click through on this, and here are the parameters in terms of what happens within the story itself. So I'm using a lovely hot pink image by default, and just got some very basic kind of text to go along with it. So that's an incredibly simple version, which is just kind of an image block, which provides essentially a label over the top of an image in different kind of guises. And within Contentful itself, we pass in our type there, type name, depth, that's it, essentially. And that basic version is all you need. Now, I guess one of the questions that some of you have probably got in your head, well, if I look at the Contentful structure I've got for a lot of my data types, well, it's going to be completely different to actually what I've got in terms of what I need for my components. And, that is obviously a bit of an issue, and actually this code needs a little bit of refactoring. But from that being the case, actually what I do in terms of the init process is actually set up mappings. And I would like to get it a bit more efficient in terms of how the mappings work at the moment, but there's two kind of layers to it. Like, number one, the mappings, you can provide a default one. So for instance, if you have got a common format of data in terms of how you're pulling into props, it might be you can go for a common function and then just get them all displaying in that same way, and that's absolutely great for you. However, when you look at something like the activity list, where you've got something a little bit different, you've got the child kind of items within it. Obviously, actually with the GQL one, because you're actually got something which kind of removes some of the layers that you get with the, I guess, a more traditional REST one, you possibly don't need to do this quite so much. But with this one, for instance, with the process activities list, we are doing a little bit of manipulation here. And I do have a common function I can use for most of the bits to actually make it a little bit easier. So we basically run it through that kind of mapping function so that what comes through to Contentful is the right format in terms of passing it through to the component itself in Storybook. And that's it. And that's quite useful. From a QA point of view, it just makes that quicker. Like, I've had various instances within agencies where you hand it over to the clients, and within a day they kind of tell me they've put content in, it's not displaying how they're expecting it to, because they may have missed out a field that we were kind of expecting to put in, and we didn't mark it as required in the right way or something like that. And actually this gives us a very quick way of validating that. We can go in, we can see it in isolation by just clicking on the button. So from a dev point of view, that's it's really useful. From a QA point of view, it's kind of useful as well. But actually, if I was to say to the editor, we've got this great tool, what you can do, you can go into Storybook, you can click this button, you can see what's happening up here. Are they really going to care? Is your product owner going to care? Is the wider team going to care? Well, possibly not. Well, probably not, I kind of suggest. And actually, that's where it comes into the bit which, I guess, hence the title of the talk, well, much more useful tool is to bring it into Contentful itself. And, you know, the actual application framework for Contentful, done various bits and pieces in it before, and it's just incredibly flexible. And I was kind of thinking, well, actually, if you consider, essentially, if you look at Contentful as being a real estate for the editor, you've got all of these fields which you can kind of go into, you can amend. Actually, is there any reason why we can't just bring the preview in there as part of that real estate? Because it is incredibly useful for them to be able to see it. And actually, if I look back at some of the agency projects I've kind of had over the years where actually the way something's been designed, it's not necessarily, it's quite ambiguous essentially in terms of what a content item might be within Contentful. You know, you might have 3 or 4 different blocks which has got like an image on the left and text on the right, and actually how do you differentiate them? And actually being able to have that preview in line is potentially incredibly useful, right? And also more immediate feedback as well. And actually that's essentially what we're going to go into, because fundamentally if you look at Storybook, it's already got the functionality to give you a page as an iframe, or just give you that story as an iframe, as opposed to showing all of it. So we can kind of take that, I'm simplifying it slightly, but we can essentially take that iframe, shove it into Contentful, and we can basically have an inline preview. And for smaller components, like we saw with the like we see here with the carousel we've got here, it might be we actually display it in line, and that's absolutely great. And then as users are editing content, they're actually seeing it change. Fantastic. I guess the problem becomes is when you're looking at kind of larger content. And the great thing with the API and the kind of extensions tools from Contentful is you can kind of do both. So you can replace entry fields if you want to create a template for a field. And essentially what we do is we wrap over the top of any data type. So we can say, well, actually, I've got this data type, which is basically called like, you know, Storybook preview. And I want to say that if a person puts in an object, they can use a view, which is Storybook preview rather than the default one. And as a result, the preview just kind of pops up essentially. And likewise, you can actually have a full screen view of it as well, which kind of just basically kind of either replaces or kind of adds on to your kind of editor view essentially. So if I jump out of here and I'm just going to go into Storybook so I can show them in situ. So the one we saw before was this one here, so the highlight stats, and I will just reload this. So what you'll probably see for a second when we reload this is the fact that actually you see the Storybook content load initially for a split second, and then because we're essentially firing into the same hook within Storybook, it's then loading the data via Contentful instead. So if we just boot this up, and it will reload hopefully quite quickly. And one thing to note here, you will notice a delay of a little bit of time before we bring in preview, and I'll explain that at the end. So there we go. It just boosts up straight away. And actually, if we kind of just click on add some tests in here, and I'm just going to publish, so it's a little bit quicker. There we go. We just see the text being amended right there in situ, right? And that's fantastic. If we want to amend the figure here as well. One thing to note is Contentful will not always save it immediately. So you will find there is kind of a little bit of a delay at times, but it is fairly kind of prompt, and you know that's kind of it essentially. So in that case, it's taking a little bit longer. So that's great, right? But I mean that's quite a simple example. I mean, where it probably gets a little bit more interesting is when you look at something like this, where we've actually got a carousel instead. And in that situation, well, what can we see? Well, if I kind of go back to start this list here, well, maybe if we just kind of swap around some of these items, right? So if we just swap out Christmas gift to be the first item rather than the second item, and hopefully this will save in seconds, it just immediately swaps over. Now, how this works is quite interesting, because this will also show you I guess the current limitations in terms of how this is working. So if I kind of just jump back into this presentation, I can just jump you through exactly how it's kind of working under the hood. So my initial version of this, I did exactly what I said before I kind of went into the demo, and actually just, you know, I pulled the iframe from Contentful and I just shoved it in as a extension I took the URL from Storybook, grabbed the iframe version, moved it into Contentful, displayed it, and it worked. The problem then being it was very much limited to the single type, because actually how do you tell Contentful what type I'm actually looking at? And if it was just a single type within Storybook, it just becomes a little bit more awkward. It becomes a bit more complicated. So I'll show you how that bit works in a minute. But essentially what we have is a base layer component. And as Stefan said at the start of this call, that actually just is basically an iframe. We've then got a config page in Contentful, and that allows you to actually just specify, well, for each of my content types, I want to use this story ID. And the story ID, you can just go into Storybook, and you can just pull out what's in the URL. So if I kind of just go back here, for instance, we'll see it fully in a minute. I can just pull out, well, I want to use this ID here. So in the case of, for instance, with a dynamic component list, if I want to display without header, I can actually see this without header. If I want to see it embedded within the page, I can actually click on full page instead. So actually there is definitely a need to be able to define which of your stories you actually want to use depending on what you're doing within Storybook. So if I kind of present in here again, and I will click through on that, and that story ID, it basically just maps into that. So in this case, I'm just using a local version of Storybook just for the example. And then the next bit, and this might prove slightly contentious in terms of how I've done it, and I'll explain why in a second, why I've done it the way I've done it in a second. So the next bit, as soon as it loads, we then use a window.post message. Not contentious in itself in terms of how we're doing it. So the Contentful extension iframe is basically loading a second iframe within it, which is a bit of a pain. I would like to kind of be able to do it directly in that parent, but it kind of feels a bit odd changing the URL of the parent when we're basically need to convert what the story ID is. So that parent one is actually called in the post item. Now I'm only sending it the ID of that content item. Initially, when I started running with this, I actually provided the actual content item itself that I was pulling via the Contentful extensions SDK, but I found that actually that was coming out in a different format than I was actually happy with. And it was a different format in terms of how I built it underneath the hood. And it just all became a little bit awkward, and I ended up making functions for the sake of just using this. And I feel the key thing for me about this as a product is making it so it just fits into your workflow. If you're using Storybook already and you're using Contentful, you should not have to add, or you should have to write absolutely minimal logic in order to have this working if it's to be a success for your product, essentially. Otherwise, it becomes an afterthought and it doesn't become successful, right? Fundamentally. So by passing in just the content item, you can load the content within the extension, within the Storybook instance, in the same way that you're actually doing within your code base, essentially. So that's essentially why I've done it that way. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, the onsys changed kind of within Contentful. Every time there's an update, we just call that again. Just send the content item ID again. So it's not the most efficient way of doing it, but it's the safest way of doing it. And if you consider, for instance, where this kind of got tricky before when I was trying to pass the actual object itself rather than just the ID, is when we look at things like the carousel, where we've got those child items, or we've got more complicated structures that we're trying to pull into this inline preview. It just didn't work the way I was expecting it to. And actually, it would have been more work trying to hack around that, essentially, rather than just passing the ID down and do a separate lookup within the extension itself, within Storybook. Now, one of the really cool things that kind of happens within apps, and I'll kind of jump in and actually display this, is actually how you can create your own config now for your extensions. So if I kind of jump out here, and I will click on one of these, and if I go into apps, I'm going to manage my apps, and there's only one active one, which is this one. We can just go in here. We can provide whichever domain we're using. So at the moment, I'm kind of in development, so I'm kind of just hooked into a development domain in terms of components themselves. And then actually, you're not probably going to want to do this for all your components necessarily. It might be you have very small level ones where actually it's almost an irrelevance kind of having it in there, but you'll see that actually I've just passed in those story IDs for the vast majority of those kind of components there. And then as soon as you update that, hit on the save, and then you can make use of it, essentially. And if I just go into the content model, I'll just show you actually how it works as well in terms of the activity row. So we've got a decent number of content types at the moment. And actually, when we look at it here, the thing that I've actually hooked it into in terms of the extension is the content type. If you go under appearance, you actually can see that actually your object type you can use the default, or you can actually select a different one. In that case, I've just hooked in this Storybook preview to be a separate one, which the user can actually select. And that's kind of it. So I guess the one that I haven't actually shown is actually separate windows. Let me show you that quickly. So in the case of the pages I showed you, well, actually, it kind of makes sense having it as a separate editor view. And then it is a case of actually, well, you edit it within this page here, and then you can see the preview here. But, the theory is basically exactly the same there. So if I kind of just go back, and I'll go back through the kind of rest of this. So we kind of had a look at that already. and we have seen that already as well. And this is the difference essentially between doing it as a field within your type and actually how you want to do it as an entry editor. So you go over to entry editors and just add a new item essentially for a storybook preview. And the very fact you've actually defined that global kind of config for it within the apps, you don't have to do anything else. Then it will just pick up, well, actually, this is my type here, component activities row. I need to link to this particular story. Now, in terms of complications, I think I've spoken already around the top one in terms of the fact they're not equal. The reason why there's a delay on load is the fact you get this 429 kind of issue of too many requests in Contentful. Sorry, I've jumped to the third one rather than doing the second one. You get too many requests. So actually at the moment, I've kind of just put in like a 5-second delay. So waits 5 seconds, load that preview then, hopefully by then, unless you've got something with a lot of child components, actually there's no more requests coming through. And actually I am finding on some occasions, if I look at, for instance, that page view you saw before, there's something like, I think there's a limit of 20 components on that page. So I am finding on sporadic occasions after the 5 seconds, it's still actually generating requests for all those children, unfortunately. One of the things that it doesn't currently do, which Stefan had a really good idea for actually, was in terms of actually how you detect child content item updates. So if I kind of come back out and show you, so if I go back in, actually, if I go to a previous slide, actually, I probably can demonstrate it a bit more succinctly. So the sys.entry.onsys, sdk.entry.onsys change works on the current item you're updating within the editor, right? So if I kind of go in here and go into my editor here, essentially this preview is associated to my ID of 1A, 9L, SOB, etc. If I click on one of these and make a change and hit save, well, it's a completely different content entry. This entry over here does not know the fact that one of these sub items has changed, so it doesn't actually know the fact it needs to update itself. Now, a couple of ways, I guess, the kind of obvious ways to work around this. Number one, potentially we could stick it on a poll and every 5 seconds load a new version. Doesn't necessarily feel the most efficient. So actually the other way, than the way that Stefan suggested, was actually shoving a little refresh button essentially for the instances where that occurs. It's not necessarily the prettiest of solutions. I really want to find a way around it, but unfortunately at the moment I haven't quite figured it out in my head in terms of, well, actually, do we pull a list of the child IDs or something and, you know, poll whether the change date on those or something like that, but it's not quite there yet from that point of view. And the kind of other bits, 49 is just covered. Delaying content saving, again, as we saw, is not as smooth if you're an editor and making changes, having to wait that second or so you don't have to publish the content and potentially put it live before it's ready. And then finally, in terms of Storybook itself, now, obviously it's been fundamental for my talk here because otherwise I wouldn't have had a talk, but essentially all we're doing is we've got an iframe, we're loading content via Storybook. And Storybook's great because it gives you a lot of functionality like the hooks. I'm bringing data in, it works very smoothly. But ultimately, for instance, if you weren't using Storybook or you had a full page, which is a lot more complicated than the pages I'm dealing with here, well, could you not just have an iframe, load your page in it, and then just reload the whole page? Well, absolutely, you could do that. You know, there's no reason why not. And actually then it's just using the SDK kind of event that I showed you before in terms of just bringing that through and updating it, you know. And yeah, I think that's possibly it. Sorry, I think I've gone slightly over as well, but that's kind of the end.